Let's revisit the 7 husbands and 8 weddings of Elizabeth Taylor. One of these relationships was deemed so controversial that the Vatican publicly condemned it. That being said, here's a relationship timeline of the exes of Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth was married for the first time to Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the Hilton Hotels and great uncle to Paris Hilton. They originally met at a nightclub when Elizabeth was only 17 years old, and a year later on May 6, 1950, they were married. Unfortunately, they were only married for less than a year because Elizabeth said that on their honeymoon, Nicky spent the entire time being physically and emotionally abusive towards her, and he had a gambling and drinking problem. They were divorced a year later in 1951. On February 21st, 1952, Elizabeth married actor Michael Wilding, who was 20 years her senior. They ended up having 2 children together and were said to have divorced because he grew jealous of her growing career. They divorced in 1957. But don't be too sad for Elizabeth because that same year in 1957, she met the first great love of her life, Mike Todd. They married that same year and had 1 daughter together, but unfortunately Mike Todd passed away just 1 year later in a plane crash in a plane he named after Elizabeth. Now, Elizabeth Taylor was a grieving widow who was relying a lot on her friends Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds for support. This support ultimately led Eddie Fisher to leave his wife Debbie Reynolds for her best friend Elizabeth Taylor. In 1959, they got married in Las Vegas and they divorced in 1964, which finally brings us to the iconic on and off again relationship between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Now, when Elizabeth first met Richard, she actually turned him down because she knew he was a notorious ladies' man. But 9 years later, they reconnected on the set of the movie Cleopatra, and they began one of the most tumultuous and iconic love affairs in Hollywood history. Now, they were both married to other people when they began this steamy affair, and it became a huge tabloid frenzy. So much so that the Vatican publicly condemned it. Now, they married for the first time in 1964. They would divorce in 1974, but don't you worry because they would get remarried again in 1975, only to divorce again in 1976. Elizabeth eventually remarried for the 7th time when she married Republican politician John Warner. They met at a dinner where he was asked to escort her to meet the Queen of England. And I guess at this dinner, sparks were flying, and so that year in 1976, they decided to get married. Eventually, their hectic work schedules got in the way, and so they divorced in 1982, but remained friendly. Which brings us to Elizabeth Taylor's 8th and final marriage to construction worker Larry Fortensky. They were married in 1991 at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch. I did an entire video breaking down the wedding if you want to check that out. They met in rehab and quickly hit it off, but unfortunately got a divorce in 1996. Larry publicly went on record to say that he could not handle the fame the same way that Elizabeth could. Elizabeth Taylor never remarried and passed away in 2011. Next, I will be revisiting the 9 husbands of Zsa Zsa Gabor.